Now, moving right along from that sombering piece of news and in that more saddening piece of news, I want to talk about something that's a little bit unusual but has been gaining a lot of traction lately, and for reasons which I don't understand why. For those of you who haven't heard, bare knuckle fighting is an organization that basically allows two combatants, male and or female, not cross gender, right? We're not having males versus females, we have females versus females, males versus males. Fighters of all experience, of all races, of all ethnicity, fighting in controlled environments. And if you couldn't tell, bare knuckle fighting involves wrapping the fighter's hand lightly in a wrap, a thin wrap, may I add, and going at it against their opponent. Now, one may ask, well, what's so bad about that? And the thing is, when you look into it, bare knuckle fighting doesn't allow kicks, takedowns, elbows, knees. It is not professional mixed martial arts. In my opinion, bare knuckle fighting is a step backwards in the professionalism that mixed martial arts has established within the recent years. And where I'm going with this is because we have two retired fighters, two recently retired fighters, may I add, in Johnny Hendricks and Brennan Ward, agreeing to fight each other in a bare knuckles boxing match. Now, if you don't know who Johnny Hendricks and Brennan Ward are, Johnny Hendricks is a former UFC welterweight champion who has fought in the likes of GSP, John Fitch, Martin Kampmann, Robbie Lawler. He went currently in a slid where in his last 6 fights he was only able to win one, which is a unanimous decision victory over Hector Lombard, and losing to the likes of Stephen Thompson, Neil Magny, Paulo Costa, just to name a few. And not saying that losing to those fighters is a bad thing in any sense. Those fighters are absolute killers. Those are the top of the top in the welterweight division. Johnny Hendricks has had a miraculous career, one of the best careers in welterweight history. He is a former champion with a fight where he arguably beat GSP. He forced GSP to retire at that time because of the beating he implemented on one of the greatest ever. But back in June, he decided to retire, and I don't blame him. At the level he has achieved, at the age he's at the projects he's working with, and at the difficulties he had in making weight, I don't blame him for retiring. I don't think his heart was in it, and I don't think his mind was in it, and I don't think the paychecks he was getting balanced the agony and hardship he had to endure for his fights. But then he goes and fights and agrees to fight in a bare knuckle boxing match against Brennan Ward, who I'll get into in a second, Mr. Ward. But back to Johnny Hendricks and back to my distaste of the boxing, bare knuckle boxing realm. The reason why I don't like it is because the UFC and Bellator, including Strikeforce, are organizations that worked to make a sport which was highlighted with barbarianism, with people with no technical backgrounds, bar fighters, big goons, stepping in and fighting each other until somebody gets knocked out. There was a lack of technique, there was a lack of skill, and there's this lack of athleticism, just to name a few, in terms of their athletes. Even the organizations back then did a poor job of making the sport a professional sport. Until nowadays, where we have organizations like the UFC who have really turned this sport into something more organized and more professional. Now you see not only the biggest and baddest, but you have true athletes who are dedicating their life into this sport, into technique, and into maintaining longevity in their career by reducing the amount of shots they take, by avoiding those bar down, chin up, haymaker fights to be smarter and more successful and more tactical in their octagon appearances. And it took some time for that to get to that level. And I believe bare knuckle boxing is a step backwards and it's a step back to barbarianism. And that's what that is. And I'm not saying it's not entertaining. Don't confuse what I say. I am a hater, but I am entertained just as much as anybody else is with this sport. And I will give it one benefit. The benefit with bare knuckle boxing is that it is safer. It is arguably the safest form of combat sports that ties in with boxing, kickboxing, or mixed martial arts. And I'll explain why. It's because they have no gloves. A lot of people assume that when in boxing you wear your 14 or 16 ounce gloves that it's safer for the fighter because it's padded. But that could not be further from the truth. When you wear those padded gloves, you're giving more surface area to hit your opponent's head and to be able to hit their chin to knock them out. You're not softening the blow, you're actually making it easier to hit your opponent and you're dealing more damage. While in bare knuckle boxing, you are lightly wrapped with no gloves, making the surface area where you hit your opponent much harder to achieve, and the percentage of a knockout are significantly less as well. Also, the fact that there's no knees, no ground game, no elbows definitely makes this sport safer in terms of the fighter's health, but it is still bare knuckle boxing and it is not organized enough for me to give it the respect that I give and share with Bellator and UFC in making combat sport a professional sport that can rival other sports like NHL, NBA, NFL. But that's besides the point. I want to talk about Brennan Ward now. Brennan, I'm just going to say a few things about you. Brennan Ward's coming off two deadly losses in Bellator. He was supposed to compete in Bellator 205, which is happening this Friday, September 21st. But just last weekend, he announced to the organization that he is pulling out of the fight due to retirement. Nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with retiring from mixed martial arts. You have proven yourself as a skilled combatant and have performed in a sport where the majority of the population doesn't even have the balls to train for. Never mind fighting. And if you just retired on 2 weeks' notice, well, you get a few sour looks, but at the end of the day, you have to do what's best for you. And if retirement is what you had to do, then that's fine. You kind of screw Bellator, and in most cases, a final retirement hoorah fight will involve one last appearance in an octagon or ring or whatever it may be. Not 2 weeks before, but I can live with that. The thing that I cannot live with is when you screw Bellator and your opponent almost a week before your fight to retire and then sign and agree to fight in a whole different organization. What the fuck is that about, Brennan Ward? I can't imagine bare knuckle boxing paying you more than Bellator because they're both open source sponsor events and organizations, and I bet you Bellator pulls more views than bare knuckle fighting. And yet you chose to alter out of your fight with Bellator and into a fight with a much out of his prime Johnny Hendricks, also retired in June. So I don't understand the mentality or the thought process of retiring that early. I mean, retiring that soon to a fight to accept another fight. And I'm not going to sit here and make predictions, but what I am going to do is that the facts are on the table, and the facts do not make you look good, Mr. Ward. And I can almost guarantee that for whatever motive you have to go to bare knuckle boxing, and if you choose to return to Bellator or UFC, you will have a much harder time to land a significant opponent. And that's where I will end it, because I'm not a fan of bare knuckle boxing. I'm also not a fan of what Brennan Ward did, and I'm not a fan that Johnny Hendricks retired due to lack of motivation to then accept another fight, and I quote, because he still loves to fight.